When Russia annexed Crimea, this was a complete rewriting and revision of the entire post-Cold War security order that rested on the fact that there are international treaties that the Russian Federation and European and American partners sign, and then they're respected. Of course, I was talking about the Budapest Memorandum. When Russia broke that treaty, there was almost no consequences. And that continues to be the case. You know, NATO, for example, needs to understand that its role needs to be revised, right? The UN needs to be revised in some way because Russia is no longer part of the democratic, liberal world order as it once was. And that's what these institutions are. They are part of trying to keep peace in very unstable times. And when you have an aggressor that has disproportionate power in such an organization, it is, I think, very hypocritical and doesn't actually make much rational sense. But what we haven't seen is much initiative, unfortunately, particularly from European allies, to really change the charter of the UN in some way to make it more difficult for countries like Russia, other authoritarian regimes, to get their way in these organizations. You know, it's difficult to predict, honestly, what Russian strategy in Ukraine will be. I think they have found themselves in a difficult position, which is why we now see the ceasefire holding, which is why we now see Russia trying to be a nice partner, quote unquote, to the European allies, trying to cooperate in Minsk. But at the same time, I wouldn't rule out another aggression, so a military incursion, because this is a lever that Russia has used. It could use it again if things don't go in the right direction. I think on the question of decentralization, it's an important question because, as you said, right now they're the first local elections since Maidan, since the revolution, which really, I think, closes the cycle of elections. You had the presidential elections, the parliamentary elections, now the local ones. And they're important because decentralization in Ukraine has to happen in some form, right? Ukraine has been very much overly centralized, which is a leftover of the Soviet regime. Ukraine has a long history in self-governance traditions. And so I think it is important to provide more power to the regions to control their own budgets or tax collection. On the other hand, there's also a potential problem there. And the problem, of course, is that particularly in some eastern regions where there were strongholds for the Party of Regions, Yanukovych's last party, now called the Self-Opposition Bloc, as we all know, these people are likely to remain in power in those places. So what happens now? We have decentralization reform, when these people who are essentially crooks and criminals get more control over their local budgets. It really can potentially set up the preconditions for more corruption. And I think there's ways of dealing with that. There's ways to address that. But I think there has to be sort of a dual strategy. And the second part of that dual strategy has to be the Ukrainian civil society, not just in Kiev, right, where, of course, it's very vibrant and very active, but in the regions becomes more aware of their own local problems, that starts to call out the local politicians when they don't see good things happening, when they don't see roads being repaired, when they don't see schools being built, when they see corruption on a daily basis. Like, Ukrainian citizens at some point, not just in Kiev, but in all the regions, will have to take the responsibility for holding their leaders accountable.
How to deal with this strategically? What advices could you give to our government and society?
You know, I think it's such a difficult question. I think now in this particular moment in history, Ukraine has the best chance of succeeding in its own democracy, in its economic reform process. I don't think there's been a chance like this before. I don't think the Orange Revolution gave Ukraine and Ukrainian civil society the opportunity to really develop as much as it did. I think this Maidan truly did. You know, this was a grassroots movement. It wasn't around some political leader. Regular Ukrainians participated so much more than they did in the Orange Revolution. So I think if this moment is lost, it could be very, I think, upsetting and sad for Ukraine. But what I see when I'm here, which is we don't hear so much about this in Washington, is the fact that among Ukrainian civil society activists, young people, there's still energy, there's still momentum. And I think the question now is, can that momentum, can be transferred outside of Kiev. Because I know in the region the situation can be very different. People perhaps are not as active. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that when we think about it, Ukraine's a very young country. It's a very young democracy, and expectations are so high. But in reality, it takes a very long time for people's mindsets to change, right? For people to understand that they have power to communicate with their local leaders, right? To hold them accountable when things aren't going in the way that they want them to go. And to also not just take a step back, but be more engaged. And I think this takes time to develop. And we're seeing that now. And I think with the new generation of Ukrainians, some of whom are now in parliament, of course, we'll see more and more of that. But it will be a long-term process.